So that's affecting, you know, how much water is available for irrigators, for any water provider that's pulling water out of the streams, and then also conditions in the streams. And then also, as we've been seeing, is that that dry vegetation is really flammable vegetation. Last year, I was watching one of the briefings for the Pine Gulch fire, just north of us here in Grand Junction, and they were talking about the moisture content in the vegetation being about the same or less than your average piece of paper. So, so this these hotter conditions with the thirstier atmosphere just kind of desiccates everything and primes fires to burn in ways that they didn't used to burn, and at higher elevations than they used to burn at, and with more extreme fire behavior. And at the same time, that thirstier atmosphere, if it has some moisture available to it, like if it's come up from a tropical storm from the south, it can actually hold more moisture. So when it lets that go in a rainstorm, we have harder rains than we used to have. And this is something all across the country. If you look at the EPA's non-point source pollution guidance and different best management practices for that, one of the challenges is that rains are harder and more impactful than they used to be. So that ends up leading to more sediment runoff, which can bring water quality problems, which are especially acute if you've got ash and debris from wildfires in them. You can get more intense flooding, and you can get more erosion, which is a topic that I think that Greg will be getting into a little bit more. And in extreme cases, then you have situations like Glenwood Canyon, which I'm sure everyone's heard plenty about by now. But I never fail to be kind of amazed by the pictures of that. So just to dive into the drying side of things when it comes to surface water, there's a lot going into the slide, but I keep on reusing it. I stole it from Brad Udall, who presented it at one of our forums a few years ago. So just to explain what's going on here, this top line here shows Colorado River flows, and it's going back to the early part of the 20th century. And this gray line, the gray line shows just how volatile they are. We know we live in a volatile system with lots of ups and downs, but you can see the trends more when you look at, the straight linear trend, which is down, and you see the running average, which is a little bit wavier, but that gives us some information on, when we've had drought periods and when we've had wetter periods. So you can see the drought in the 30s, a little deeper drought in the 50s, wet period in the 80s and 90s, and then the last 20 years or so, which has been called the Millennium Drought, and other names as well, not pleasant ones. So this is what we've been seeing in terms of trends in the Colorado River, generally drier, and especially the last 20 years or so. But if you jump down to this bottom line, and this is all how it shows up in flows in the river. But if you jump down to this bottom line and look at what's been going on with precipitation, the trends are not nearly as clear. They're also very volatile, but you don't have the same overall negative trend. You even have a slight increase. And we usually think of droughts as being caused by a decrease in precipitation, but you can see that in the 50s, that dip in the volume of flows in the river matches up reasonably well with a period when there was also less precipitation. So that kind of fits our traditional understanding of what causes a drought. But then if you look at the drought that we're in now, and you go down and you look at what's been going on with precipitation, it doesn't line up nearly as well. So it seems like precipitation what's been going on with precipitation just does not explain the current drought nearly as well. But if you look at that, if you look at the middle, at this middle line here, this helps us explain that difference. So this is the overall trend in temperatures. And while the overall precipitation trend is not that pronounced, our trend in temperatures, while it's also volatile, is much more pronounced. And you can see that we're on an overall warming trend that's been accelerating the last 40 or 50 years or so. And so our the current drought that we're in really coincides with when we've been getting much warmer temperatures. So that helps underscore how much of a part of our hydrologic cycle and how much water availability is tied to our temperatures. And this is the reason why the word aridification is up there. With one of the characteristics of a drought is eventually it's over and it ends. But with aridification, you have a longer term change in the basic characteristics of the climate. And if you look ahead at what the climate models are telling us, they're kind of all over the map as far as forecasting what precipitation could do in our region in terms of just raw amounts. But they line up, they're in pretty close agreement that the warming trend we've been seeing is likely to continue. So this impact of warmer temperatures drying out our landscapes and reducing water availability seems to be a long-term trend that we'll need to adapt to. And related to that, we have the basic story of the Colorado River, which has been over-allocated from when we first started allocating it, basically. So this little diagram shows how back in 1922, the states that share the river and divvied it up, plus an allocation for Mexico. So you can see they came up with a formula of 7.5 for the lower basin, 7.5 for the upper basin, 1.5 for Mexico, which equals 16.5 million acre feet in a year. But if you look at the long-term trends in what the flows have actually been, and this is just downstream from Glen Canyon Dam, you can see that that orange line is the long-term average, and it's never really reliably been above 15 million acre feet. So even if we had no change in our climate and no reduction in flows, we would already be getting kind of into a little bit of a pickle. Basically, the way that we've been able to get by this long with this over allocation is that it's taken a while for the different states to get close to actually using physically as much water as they're allocated on paper. And in the upper basin, we're still not even close. And then we also have the really big reservoirs of Lakes Mead and Powell to cushion the ups and downs in the river. But rather than just cushioning the ups and downs in the river, they've been to some degree facilitating our overuse for the last couple of decades. So we've gotten ourselves into a situation where our teacups here that are representing Lake Powell and Lake Mead are really pretty low. And I like this, there are lots of different teacup diagrams out there. I like this particular one because it shows how much narrower they are at the bottom. So if you drop 10 feet and you're up here, you've still got a whole lot of water left. You drop 10 feet down here, you're getting closer and closer to dead pool. So I feel like this teacup diagram, does a pretty good job of showing, how low our bank account really is in these two reservoirs. And this next slide, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on it, but it's from some 2007 guidelines that the states agreed to for how to manage the two reservoirs. And the key thing to notice is that we just tipped over into a shortage condition. And this is triggered by the August forecast of what the levels in Lake Mead will be. So we've gotten to the point where we're actually having to take action to make sure that our bank accounts don't zero out. And so Arizona is going to take some pretty substantial cuts in deliveries. They're also going to reduce, Powell is low enough that they'll reduce the amount that's getting released downstream. But all of this is to just kind of point to the fact that throughout the history since the compact was signed in 1922 or agreed to in 1922, the upper basin, which Colorado is a part of, has never been in trouble with its downstream obligations. But we're getting to the point where it's plausible that within the next 5 years or so, we could be. And so this is something that even in the 10 to 15 years that I've been paying attention to the Colorado River pretty intensely, at the beginning of that period, we saw that as kind of an abstract, far off possibility and an argument point for saying that Denver and Northern Water shouldn't take any more water over the Continental Divide because it could get us in trouble with the compact. But it still seemed sort of, far off and scary, but not that likely. But now it's becoming a much more tangible possibility. So there are a number of legal ambiguities in exactly what that obligation could look like. But for the purposes of this conversation, my purpose in bringing it up is that in addition to the hydrologic challenges, as far as just how much water we see on the landscape and in our streams naturally, there are also these legal issues that come into play that might cause us to need to let more water flow downstream than we would have in the past. So that it's another factor impacting the surface water availability that we could be seeing in the future. Is that clear? Does anybody have any questions on that point? Okay, but never mind the compact. Drier conditions are obviously a problem for us in a lot of different dimensions. These are just some headlines I pulled from this summer that demonstrate the impacts when we have dry conditions on the rangeland and also less water available to irrigate pastures and hay meadows and so on. You have ranchers that are needing to sell off cattle because they can't grow enough forage and hay to support them. When you have lower water levels in the rivers and streams, in the reservoirs, you end up with more algae, and some of that algae can be toxic. So that's pretty highly unpleasant. And then we've seen a lot of these kinds of headlines too this summer. These low water conditions and warmer waters really stress our trout fisheries. So that has knock-on impacts too to our tourism sector when our gold medal trout streams aren't really fishable, or at least not ethically fishable. And then it can also affect our domestic water supplies. This headline here just refers to the fact that Ute Water, the biggest water provider, domestic water provider between Denver and Salt Lake, they normally source all of their domestic water from high up on the mesa. It's fantastic, fresh snowmelt water, but they actually this year dipped into their Colorado River supplies, which caused some treatment challenges for them and some taste issues for their customers. And different domestic water providers will have different issues related to this lower water availability. And some domestic water providers that rely more on direct flow from rivers and streams and maybe don't have a whole lot of storage in their system, they could actually face more acute challenges of keeping the supplies up. And in those situations, you might see more watering restrictions. So a challenge in lots of different dimensions. So that's the basic water supply picture in terms of things to be aware of. But at the same time, because that's not enough, we also have a number of infrastructure challenges, which I'm sure you guys are aware of. But just to point to those, a couple of things to think about. A lot of our infrastructure that we rely on is old, particularly irrigation infrastructure. The roller dam that pulls out most of the irrigation water for the Grand Valley celebrated its 100th birthday not too long ago with a dam birthday party. And a lot of our smaller irrigation infrastructure is also pretty old and vulnerable. And then domestic infrastructure as well. And it's also one of the things that the fire in Woodwood Canyon pointed out is, is the changes in our geologic hazards and our fire hazards also pose new risks to this domestic infrastructure. So it really points to the need for more redundancies and alternative supplies, because you can have a really big shock to your infrastructure that you'll need to compensate for. Another issue in lots of places across the West Slope is that in some of our smaller communities, there's really pretty limited capacity to absorb some of these new challenges, and also just keeping up with increasing populations and then new regulatory challenges. It's fantastic to have continually better protections for drinking water supplies, but those come with increasing technology requirements and knowledge requirements for systems to keep up with. And that can be particularly challenging when you have In these small communities, oftentimes the person that runs the water treatment plant also runs the sewage plant if there is one, and they also, they also are responsible for taking care of the parks, and they kind of do everything. So that's something to be aware of if you're, involved with the development in a small community. So we got a lot of challenges. We fortunately also have some strategies that are out there. One that has been really picking up steam the last 5 years or so is integrating water and land use planning. So, these two areas of planning, if you look at just the structure of local governments, they've tended to be really siloed. You have the people that deal with the water, and you have the people that deal with all the land use planning ordinances, and they really weren't talking to each other very much. But there have been a lot of moves to integrate those more. I put a link up there, and I'll send this out to your coordinators so you can just directly link on it. But it's also pretty easy to find by just Googling water and land use planning Colorado, or if you go through the DOLA website or the CWCB website, you can find it. But there's a lot of different resources there. There have been some partnerships with NGOs on doing different kinds of trainings and just workshops where they bring the water and the land use planning side together, and there's a handbook for different things to look at. So lots of great resources there. And so, when you're thinking about integrating water and land use planning, you're doing things like looking at density, which, since about half of domestic water use tends to be outside as a rough average, the denser you have development, typically the more water efficient is. But then there are different things to look at too, like your landscaping ordinances and your looking at your particular situation in terms of water, and looking at the long term and seeing if new development has an identified secure water supply going forward. Also, landscaping, looking ahead to the long term and choosing plants that can survive in a hotter, drier climate. I was talking to a guy that runs our local parks down by the river on one of his riparian restoration projects. And he was choosing some plants that are actually not typically native to this area. Their typical range is a little bit south of here, but looking ahead to a warmer future, the New Mexico privet could be a better choice than some of the plants that have historically thrived here as conditions get hotter. And then also reconsidering flood hazards. Just because an area hasn't flooded in the past doesn't mean it won't flood in the future. And a chronic problem that we've had is that our official flood maps, I'm sure you're aware, have been out of date often for a long time and don't necessarily take into account development of the floodplain and things like that. But with these changes in the water cycle and the possibility for more intense rain events and so on, that I think will become a bigger issue going forward. So something to really look at. And also improving headwaters health. Anything we can do for the health of our forests, of course, will reduce fire danger. And also the more our rangeland and our soils and our streams in the headwaters can retain water and hold it back and let it trickle down slowly, then you're in a better position overall. When things are degraded, the water flashes off more quickly, and you can have, both bigger problems with flooding potentially, but also bigger problems with water availability later in the summer. So anything you can do to improve the health of the streams and the land and the headwaters is going to carry benefits all downstream. And then finally, partnering and investing. So there are a number of different levels where there are promising developments here. On the irrigation side of things, you see a lot of partnership with environmental groups and irrigation entities, revamping infrastructure to be more fish friendly, but also work better for the agricultural irrigators. But on the domestic side also, for example, in the Grand Valley, a big part of the resilience of our domestic water infrastructure is the fact that 4 different entities that pull their water from 4 different sources, 2 different sides of the Grand Mesa, plus the Colorado River, plus the Gunnison River. They all have interconnects. So if there's a catastrophe on one part of the system, then the others can pitch in and serve that area. So that's another kind of partnering. And I've heard of initiatives of trying to have more regional cooperation in other areas too, and that can help compensate for some of those infrastructure capacity challenges too. And investments, we got a lot of water infrastructure is kind of out of sight, out of mind, but you have problems when it's neglected for too long. So that's it for my presentation. This is just a website if you want to learn more about us. You can sign up for our monthly e-newsletter. We have a Twitter account, and then this is just a program also related to resilience for our annual Upper Basin River Forum that is going to be happening in early November. So with that, I can take any kind of clarifying questions right now, but my inclination, if there aren't any that are too urgent, is just to turn it over to Greg so we can hear from him and then have a bigger discussion at the end.
That sounds great. Thanks, Hannah. Greg, you want to go ahead and jump in?
Greg, you're still muted.
There we go. Thank you. So I'm just going to jump in on this side and mainly just talk from a geology perspective. So most of us who live here in Colorado know a little bit about geology. And for those of you, maybe there are a couple of geology majors here, or you've taken some courses and things like that, I will be mainly just covering things from a basic perspective, but it's really all about talking a little bit about the really thinking about the geology thing, because again, hopefully I'll be able to do at the end a bit what Hannah did and emphasize how we can see, well, there are issues related to geology, but there are also a lot of resources we can get to on the geologic side. Okay. All right. So the things I wanted to talk about here. So I wanted to have a discussion about geologic framework of sort of western and northern Colorado. I'm really covering everything from Denver on over on the western and northern side, and think about the geologic processes are there. And again, I'm going to try and simplify things on that perspective. And then the next thing we'll do is we'll come over here and talk a little bit about the subsurface water side now that we've looked at the surface water component. So first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about geology and landslides. And what I really like to stress about any kind of landslide things. Now, first off, you should know geologists use this term mass wasting to cover any kind of ground motion. So we like to differentiate a mud flow where what it is it's mud and it's flowing, from a rock fall where it's rock but it's falling, from landslides where it's trees and debris sliding down a slope. We like to differentiate those as geologists, but we throw them under all the big category of mass wasting. Ultimately, the equation, though, right, is the earth, meaning what is it that's moving, the water component, and then of course gravity. But turns out, depending on what fraction of all of these things come into play, they generate different kinds of hazards. So for instance, when we think about rock falls, where dominantly what we have is high steep slopes, again, thinking I-70 corridor, high steep slopes, but we also have construction on places like this. Most of what's critical there is the geology. What is the rock doing? Water can have an influence on actual rock falls off steep faces, but not always, and usually gravity is the main driver there. Rock falls in general are either triggered by some sort of small seismic activity, or sometimes it turns out to be just their time to go. The analogy I give is there's not always a major event, but it's kind of like if you have ever been in an older house and you're sitting there and suddenly, something in the floorboards pops or creaks. It's not, there wasn't a truck that went by, there wasn't wind blowing. Sometimes that makes everything creak, but sometimes the stresses have just slowly built up enough over time that it's their time to go. And so that's what we tend to see with rock falls. Rock slides and landslides, on the other hand. So this isn't just rock tumbling off a cliff. This is things moving downslope more like we saw this summer on the interstate. Clearly, also, again, geology is critical, and this time water comes into play. And I will just reiterate with what Hannah said, which is not only are these water issues end up being important, but one of the things we're really wrestling with now is the unpredictability of the water characteristics are causing these things to happen where, in fact, they weren't on anybody's radar before because no one was expecting to see, a week of multiple inches of rain at this location, or multiple inches of rain at this location after a really long drought, because that really changes around all the geologic properties. And then, of course, on these rock slides and landslides, gravity is a critical component. And then we get to mudslides, and there any source of mud can be the case. So one of the real important sources of mud that we're getting more and more of now is, essentially topsoil that is not held in place by living vegetation after a wildfire. So wildfire comes in, kills off everything that's been tying what little soil we may have on some steep hill slopes. And now that turns into something that as soon as we have water, which is certainly critical to mudslides, we now can get these areas where, once again, we haven't had mudslides in decades, if not millennia, and that's because we have places that haven't burned in that long. But there are certainly other components of places where we can have mudslides, old reservoirs, old tailings piles, mine drainages, things like that. We can also get mudslides coming off of dumps, that kind of thing. And for mudslides, although gravity is important, we can get mud moving on a pretty low slope. So that's not always the most critical thing. So to me, then, if we're thinking about how we have to worry about hazards for land slope, certainly the regional and the subsurface geology is important. That's our earth component of the equation. Precipitation and groundwater, that's our water component. And then topography is really what's going to be contributing and controlling the gravity. So when we think about regional subsurface geology, I'm going to give you this sort of flash minute and a half overview of the geology of Colorado, which of course normally could be a semester long course, but there are some real importance when it comes to construction and hazards and water. So really where we live in Colorado is built on what I think of as three main features, three main geological components. And not surprisingly, these actually show up if you're out visiting a national park and all that. You're going to places and national monuments throughout the West. These are things that tend to show up pretty frequently. So if you've ever seen a diagram like this, because you're down and around to the Grand Canyon, what seems to happen is there's always this smush or sort of just gooey part of the deepest, oldest rocks that's always at the bottom. And then we have some sort of tilted and deformed rocks in the middle. And then we kind of get this layer cake and pancake view on the top. And this sort of relates to these three main components I'm going to talk about. So here's what one of these geologic stratigraphic columns looks like in the Grand Canyon. And if we go to Colorado National Monument, we see the same thing here. We see sort of this complicated melange of smushy things down at the bottom. These are the really old rocks. Then we see some other things with some tilting and moving, and then we get into this layer cake thing at the top. So this actually comes into play in just about anything that's, west of sort of a connector between Fort Collins, Denver, Pueblo. So most of eastern Colorado, when we look at groundwater problems and all that, they're very similar to what you would have in Kansas, Nebraska, and those parts of our country. But as soon as you move to the west of that, you're in this whole complicated area where these three things really come into play. So the first of these three things is what makes that smushy rock, that sort of really complicated old rock that always seems to sit all the way at the bottom of everything. And because it's at the bottom, oftentimes we find it deep in canyons like Black Canyon of the Gunnison. We can find it deep in canyons in Wyoming, like if you're going over the Bighorn Mountains or the Wind River Mountains. But because we have some other things going on, those deep rocks can sometimes be at the surface. Those rocks, geologists will either call basement rock, or because of their age, we call those Precambrian. And all you really need to know is Precambrian just means older than 500 million years. Now, the reason those rocks are all really sort of smushed up and crazy is because those rocks were made of the collisions of all the little tiny pieces of continental crust that went into making all the big continents. So this is the assembly of all those different pieces of crust, which geologists have names for in here as origins or provenances in here. And where we are down in Colorado, we're sort of at this boundary between the Wyoming and the Yavapai provinces in here. And those were really old mountain building events, lots of collisions, lots of mountain building, lots of volcanics. And then that whole area just got eroded flat. And then we built everything else since then on top of it. But the point is, those old rocks, they were already pretty complicated because of this mountain building event. And they're kind of what sits as our basis or our foundation in the geology. Now, interestingly, two things have then happened since that ancient time. There have been actually two major other mountain building events, and most people only think of one, which is what ends up being the Rocky Mountains as we see them today. But actually, there was an older one. So there, in fact, there's what's called the ancestral Rockies and then the modern Rockies. The ancestral Rockies were about the same place as the big mountain Rocky uplifts. So there was something called the Ancestral Front Range, but it was actually a little bit further west of Denver and Colorado Springs than the modern Rocky Mountains. And then there was also the Uncompahgre Uplift, which is actually much bigger than the Uncompahgre Uplift we see today out here in the Grand Valley. But the point of this is, during these uplifts, what was lifted to the surface was those old Precambrian rocks. So they were all brought to the surface here, okay? But the other important thing I want you to note is this was caused by a collisional event out in the Pacific. And when this happened 300 million years ago, as it was lifting these old rocks, it was creating more deformation. So those rocks that were old and those basement rocks at the bottom, as they were lifted up, they actually got redeformed again. So we took these rocks that were already pretty messy and we made them even more messy by faulting them, by folding them, by putting lots of joints and fractures in them. And we did that 300 million years ago. And then in fact, most of those mountains were eroded away over the last several 100 million years. And then only in the last, what geologists can get away with calling the recent past, which is 50 million years ago, we then have sort of what geologists call the modern Rocky Mountains. And those are the nice snow peak mountains that we see today. But what I want you to note is that these were then another set of uplifts. In some cases, they took pieces of these ancestral Rockies and re-uplifted them again. And in other cases, they took some of the older rocks sitting outside of those uplifts and uplifted again. The whole part of all of this then, why do we care, is that anytime you have one of these deformation events, it not only folds and tilts the rocks, but then it will re-break those rocks in new faults, new joints, and new fractures. And of course, the big picture there is that the geometry of all this fracturing and jointing that's going on in all of these rocks is really critical to any mass wasting. So the best way I like to think about this is if you take a whole series of things, I can take a bunch of playing cards or a bunch of sheets of paper, and I imagine these as the fractures in the joints in the rocks of all those rocks. And all we have to do is tilt those, and next thing we know, gravity takes advantage of all of those little cracks and fractures. And so one of the reasons that northern western Colorado in particular is really susceptible to mass wasting is because it hasn't just gone through one mountain building event, that ancient one. It's gone through two others since then, which has really broken up these rocks and make them primed for doing any kind of mass wasting. And so it really ends up being critical. So understanding exactly where you are you just in those older rocks that haven't experienced many deformation events? Are you in those oldest rocks that have actually gone through both of those newer mountain building events that's even more fractured and broken up? Those things are critical, and it just depends where you are geographically. And as I'll mention in just a second, as we're finishing up, those things are also, of course, critical to groundwater. Thus, and sort of the main point here is to think that, to me, when we're thinking about resiliency, we really can't think about resiliency without also wrapping in this big picture of geology. So as Hannah was mentioning, the point of sort of interfacing all these things that were traditionally siloed, really, if you're thinking about mass wasting and you have a highway department and they totally have to be interfacing with geologists, and same thing with anybody doing groundwater and hydrology has to be interfacing with geologists, because you can move just a half mile, a quarter mile, and the whole situation changes either for the worst or for the better in the way these situations work. Now, in terms of precipitation and groundwater, I'm not going to spend much time talking on how those impact hazard potentials, other than just to know that they're essentially lubricators, right? So when we get rainfall, that rainfall, when it goes down into river bottoms and all that, that's not a big problem, but the rainfall can also get into those cracks and fractures that are high on the hill slopes in there, okay? And if we look at that in a little bit more complicated picture, we can see that when we're in these alpine terrains, groundwater is really complicated. So one of the things we see that's pretty interesting, not great, but pretty interesting, is sometimes we get a heavy rainfall event, and in fact, we won't get the mass wasting. We won't get the landslides or the mud flows for days later or weeks later, or sometimes until a second big rainfall event, because similar to what Hannah was mentioning with that water getting in and just getting soaked up in the soil, if we have a significant amount of drying and then re-wetting based on climatic variations, but then we have big rainfall events, and that is complicated by this crazy fractured rock, and the fractures and tilt depend on where you live in Colorado. That water then gets in here, gets pressurized in these fractures, and if these fractures are tilting the same direction as the hill slope, then we get these things that rip loose and cause all of our problems. So water adds to that by both adding a little hydraulic pressure and also adding some lubrication. And then, of course, we all know from driving around how important topography is. It doesn't take a genius to look at the map of Colorado and recognize that you don't have a lot of rockfall problems in I-70 as you're going over into Kansas. You have some mud flow problems, because remember, mud flows don't depend on a lot of slope. You can liquefy stuff. And in fact, when you have brush fires near highways and things like that, they do have mud flow problems on the interstates. But when we're talking about rock falls and other things that can really have these big tragic impacts in addition to mud flows, we obviously have to look at the topography. And what we can do is we can look at that topography, and we can try and look at the geology, tie in what we know out of the water, link that into a map of topography, and what we try and do is ideally generate these landslide susceptibility maps. And just so you know, these things, because they are it is necessary to have a huge amount of data to build them, because you need a big geology database, you need the elevation database, and then water, of course, is very challenging to determine what it is right now or what it might be in the future. What we then try and do is generate some kind of hazard map. So we have some slopes where we have higher hazards, other areas where we have lower hazards. And be aware that these sort of landslide hazard maps are quite different from either a flood map, right? They don't always link together, or even some of the crude landslide hazard maps just rely on topography. But as hopefully I've convinced you, if you just look at the landslide, the steepness of a surface, you can actually have incredibly resilient surfaces that are steep that you'll never really in our human lifetime have to worry about sliding. Whereas you can actually have lower sloped surfaces that, because of the combination of geology and water, are worse. So these landslide susceptibility maps, right, clearly in the communities where building is going on, these are critical. And one of the things, as Hannah also mentioned, these things get really challenging in a small community, because it's not cheap to put these together, because it takes all the time and effort to do that. So one of the places I want you to look at if you get a chance, and I think a great place to start, is looking at the Colorado Department of Transportation. There's this awful link in here, but there are some really nice documents, and I'm going to run through these quick so I don't take too long. But the highway department, because of the massive amount of money that goes into issues when there's a landslide, there's a lot of money into trying to generate hazard maps and hazard systems. And of course, as you get away from the expense side of things, or you get away from really dense concentrations of people, there's less and less resources for making these. So the point is it's really challenging as you get away from expensive places like rail lines and highways, or larger congregations of humans. But the upshot is, without going into detail, is the highway department definitely goes into slope profile. You see here, they're lopping in geological characteristics of everything that's in there, and they can start to build out these kinds of hazard maps. Now, I'm going to flip through these quick, but if you look at the center at the bottom of the slide, all I'm going to do is step from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 7, which ends up all the way at Denver. So we're starting at Glenwood Springs over here. And really, all I'm trying to show you by flipping through these is know that there are data available. So if, for instance, we're doing any kind of building along the I-70 corridor without going too far away, there are some data available that you could at least start with. So as we start with Glenwood Springs, we can see dominantly here we're worrying about rockfall, but there's also rapid subsidence. So one of the things we see as water gets into some of these cracks and fractures, they can dissolve rock like gypsum, and we can actually get subsidence in there. And then we also have places in green, which are kind of these debris flows. Think of debris flows as sort of mud flows. So if we're in Glenwood Springs, we see this, but as we move over to sliding a little further towards Eagle, we see some of these things, plus some mine subsidence now going around gypsum, not surprisingly, where there are old mines. Those things can cause problems. And of course, we have major big landslides of the sort of big land movement nature. And then as we keep sliding, mainly what I want to show you is how much these change, right? So really, I want you just looking at the colors and notice that each of those colors represents a different type of mass wasting or landslide hazard. And notice as we work our way all the way across, and I'll just skip back quickly, it really does depend on where you are, what kind of hazard you're going to worry about, right? And if I just finish up here while we're talking about this, and we go to a very localized map around Georgetown, you can see that the detail that we can get to geologically, where we're really worrying about the local geology, which is these hash marked things, are different rock types, and the different kinds of chutes or topography, which can cause problems. Notice this is all dominantly focused because of the interstate, but we can see here if we are working in and around a community nearby, and let's say we're beginning to build on the other side of the interstate, there may be resources available. But this is just another map to highlight that point of the complexity of the geology. So remember, with landslide type things and mass wasting, we're talking about geology, water, and topography. But in addition, of course, to the negative impact of water contributing to mass wasting, as we already heard from Hannah, water is, of course, a critical resource in what we do with domestication, whether that's agriculture, industry, or our own natural use. And although surface water, of course, is a critical component, one of the things that starts becoming important in alpine settings is groundwater. Typically what happens is surface water is used to feed a lot of the communities that are sitting in valley bottoms, and that's because these reservoirs are sitting up high and we can gravity feed down into these low-lying communities. But as soon as building begins to go upslope, you have the problem of either using a large amount of energy to pump the community water up to communities that are up high. You're now fighting gravity, or all those new higher communities, either individual homes or individual industries, are going to be drilling groundwater wells. Okay, and so certainly as growth continues and as we have this interplay between using surface water and reservoir feeding down into the valleys, and we build up into these slopes, we're going to get more and more into groundwater settings. So just now talking about groundwater, the critical criteria are depth to water, storage of water, so not just how deep it is, but how much is there, and then how fast can you pump it out, and then of course we worry about the quality of those things. So I'll cover those. So when we talk about depth, let me just go back really quickly and say, when we are in areas that are generally large river valleys, flat plains, not a lot of alpine going on, fortunately, groundwater is pretty straightforward. So for instance, once again, if we look out here in eastern Colorado, we can generally get groundwater less than 20, 30 feet deep. Sometimes we have to go a little deeper than that, but groundwater is fairly accessible. Notice here, if we go into North or Central Park, parts of South Park, down into west of Colorado Springs, or if we go out here in parts of the Grand Valley, groundwater is pretty straightforward. But other than the parks, or the San Luis Valley, or other than eastern and places of western Colorado out in the valleys, groundwater that's going to be pulled out of sort of north central, or in some cases western Colorado, is going to be really complicated, and it's going to depend on geology. And notice this particular groundwater map by the U.S. Geological Survey is lumping where you're going to have to drill. Some of it is in volcanic rocks, but then notice here's that term Precambrian. Remember we talked about those really old rocks? So all of these places in here under this dark gray, you're going to be drilling for groundwater into these oldest of rocks, which have those complexities that we talked about before. So this is just from my previous slide, but just to sort of hit my main point now before I talk about some of the details. All of that geologic deformation that caused folding and tilting of the rocks, called faulting and fracturing of all of those rocks, not only, as we saw, is it important for mass wasting, but it's clearly critical to groundwater. So also, if we're dealing with resiliency in terms of water as a resource, and in particular groundwater as a resource, we clearly need to know the geology of what's going on. And so I will just show this slide again to imagine that in this case, instead of talking about mass wasting and hill slope movement, we're saying, where would you drill in here in order to get water for your house that's built up on the side, because you're not down in the valley where we can just use surface water or some nearby reservoir to get surface water. So now you're upslope, you're drilling in a well, and You may pull some shallow water, but as you go down deep, it's going to depend on what these fractures are doing. They're like our major water conduits in a lot of Colorado well systems. So when we think about storage, I just want to hit two key points here. Those places that I said that are kind of easy, so eastern Colorado and a lot of the basins, most of the rock where we're getting the water is generated from sediment, and most of that sediment is generally rounded or round-ish. And what's nice is that stores a lot of water and it allows us to pull a lot of water there pretty easy. The problem is, as soon as we get up into that Precambrian rock or any of those rocks that were involved in those mountain building events, instead of these nice sort of more sponge-like aquifers for pulling water, we're instead looking in these fractured rock aquifers. Notice here the examples are like the Pikes Peak granite, or if we're around Leadville and the Leadville limestone. And these things, as you can imagine, are challenging because you look along the top and say, well, it really depends on which fracture you hit. If you drill a well, you might find some spots to drill that you don't hit any water at all, even though you're going twice as deep as your neighbor. So knowing that geology is going to be really important. And then when we get into flow rates, this is just another schematic to remind us that sometimes that water in these fractured rock systems is going to have these really complicated paths. And so not only is the rate at which we pull water out highly dependent upon this fractured rock that we may be dealing with, but the recharge of new water getting into these to allow us to use these in some sort of resilient way, so we don't just drain them dry in short order, because it takes 1,000 years for the water to get through these fractures from the hill slopes down to our wells. And I only throw this in not to have to make our minds explode even further, but as soon as we get some terrains where we have landsliding, those landslides then change the surface water drainage, which changes how that water migrates down into the fractures. And in fact, we frequently see the case that if you're in any place with groundwater wells and near you there's some landslide or mass wasting, lots of times people's water levels can either go way up or they can go way down, and now they're dry because you're opening up a whole bunch of new conduit systems. So finally, we can get to quality of water, and I won't go to this in a whole bunch of gory detail other than to recognize the fact that on a lot of these places that we're drilling for groundwater, when we're drilling, so as we start to have issues and constraints on our surface water and we're pulling more and more water from groundwater, we need to remember that our groundwater oftentimes is not recharged right where we're drilling, but in fact the groundwater is recharged somewhere quite different and takes a while to get down to where we're pumping that water. So we can imagine things like in understanding the full watershed area that is encompassed by a groundwater well, we can imagine that where we extend our protections, in fact, then actually go much further afield. So rather than just saying, here's a hill slope that drains into this stream and we have to protect it, now we have to say, you know what, not just this hill slope, but there's a mountain way over there, and that way over there miles away is where the recharge area is for our groundwater. And so we actually have to protect that thing too. So the complications involved with thinking about water quality and water quality protections really get exacerbated when we understand the geology and extend this to these areas that are much larger than we expect. And again, I won't finish up here with a even more complicated diagram. I think that I've made that clear. Now, my last point, so hopefully I hit those just enough to sort of fill your brains to spilling, but I then want to reiterate this idea that now, superimposed then in all that we've talked about geology plus water plus topography, is that this water component is now really unpredictable. Okay, so 50 years ago, when we were building highways and we were building the rail lines through, things were done because 50 years before that, there was a lot of stability or I should say, more predictability in the water and the climate that would be coming through a system. And so what we should expect to see in the future is that landslide hazards and groundwater availability and as resources are going to become increasingly unpredictable. And of course, what that means is our tolerance for our sort of safety tolerances or security tolerances, or to use the term we're using for this workshop, the resilience that we need to be thinking about, because we're already in a complex system, is now going to be even broader afield. So it does make all of these things, and none of these things in my mind are certainly any easy things to be working with. But clearly, if we're going to be talking about resilience as a whole, we're unfortunately in a state that has all this natural beauty, but most of its natural beauty is generating all these geologic complexities, which then leads to these hazard problems. So I think that's where we sit. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing there and open it up. Hopefully I didn't go too much longer than we had.
Awesome. Thank you, Greg. Well, I don't know, we've gone a little bit over, so if you have to go, we certainly understand. I think I personally had maybe two major takeaways. One, we get geotech reports for most of our projects, but in my experience, we generally hand them over to the structural engineer and let them design the foundations and are kind of done with it after that. And it seems like maybe there's a lot more we could learn from our geotech reports that we're not really using or examining. And then the other thing I was, just kind of thinking about was landscaping, obviously, and the types of plants we're choosing. Having worked in Houston, which has, major flooding problems, you want to use plants that have really deep roots to help get that water into the ground. But seems like here, maybe we have some sort of interesting hybrid where part of it, we want the water to get into the ground, the plants to have deep roots to hold that soil so it doesn't slide. But then we also have this challenge of our snow melt, our snowpack not being as effective because too much of it's going into the ground and we want more of it to get into the rivers. And seems like kind of opposite problems almost. I don't know if I'm interpreting that right or not.
That's great. Let me jump just real quick on the geotechnical thing, because that's brilliant. My takeaway would be that what I frequently see is the challenge is the very localized aspect of what you get in a geotechnical report, right? So you don't actually, you might not even see what's even a couple hundred feet upslope from you, because the report is like, okay, here's the property, here's where I'm getting paid to do the report, here's my geotechnical report. So, and I don't deny that that's a real challenge, but that is, to me, the issue with all of these things that we're dealing with, right? Is you could have a geotechnical report that says you're never going to have any landslides on your property. And yet, obviously, this is an extreme case, but right next to you that's not in your property are some hill slopes that are unstable. And so that's the real challenge, is trying to operate that in a broader sense. So I think that's why, one of the things that I know Hannah's constantly dealing with is, as all these issues get tackled locally, one piece at a time, if there's no coherent whole, then everything is just a mess and you get failure all over the place. So I would say it operates, to me, in the same regard that if somebody's sort of the first one building a house up on a slope, and then somebody's thinking about it next, the real thought should be, is that whole slope, even going kilometers up to the top, is that a place that should be buildable? And right, looking at it as that whole area rather than that localized thing. So I agree with there's huge values in those geotechnical reports, but what they obviously aren't doing is projecting out into the environment, because we know that our bigger environment has much more impact on us than just our backyard. So, but that's a great question.
So I'm from the Vail area, and our town of Vail geological information is a whole. And so we have the whole maps. And so you need to tie into those around us.
Totally. Right. And it's brilliant. I'm glad you brought that up, because that was sort of what I was getting at, where there are resources, right? And so we know why there's a lot of money in Vail to build whole town maps of geology, because there's a lot of money in Vail. And as soon as you go in between to some smaller town, or let's say now somebody's starting to move into the mountains away from Vail, then that becomes a challenge. You get off the edge of the map. So that's, I agree with you 100% that when we're near the interstate and near these pockets, there is great information to be had, and that's an awesome place to start. And as soon as we start, people start doing their thing where they want to have their own space and get away from people, that's usually where the trouble comes.
And that's, I don't know if you've ever looked on the Town of Vail website. There's a whole geological.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. We run field trips through there a lot, and that's where we pull a lot of our information from, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
I just wanted to jump back to Jenny's comment as far as the landscaping. It's actually good to have the dry soil get recharged and filled up again. It's just, the fact that it's getting so dried out in the first place, and then, it kind of takes the first cut when the snow melts, just means that there's less water available, downstream from that. But in general, the more we can keep those areas moist, the better. But yeah, just my point on the landscaping is just, don't just think about past conditions, when you're thinking about landscapes and, creating a durable landscape, but, if you can kind of lean towards things that are, that can thrive in drier and warmer conditions, maybe on that edge of, of what's able to grow in your climate zone, then that'll be a better long-term choice.
That's Hannah. If I may ask, I was particularly interested in your discussion that you were looking at different plants for the hotter climate, and this is going to come about from not me as an architect, but as a landowner. We own, my husband and I own 15 acres on the Colorado River, 5 river miles downstream of Dewey Bridge, and we have water rights down there. And so I know that area quite well. And so I've watched the tamarisk over the last 25 years. And that was vegetation that was introduced, but was a water hog. And so I've seen that they're trying to get rid of it. So if you can explain to me how that's done. But then that's what brought up to me different plants. Look at what introducing the tamarisk did to the Colorado River Basin.
Yeah, I would. So I wouldn't want to, go too far afield when you think about, different plants, but it's just kind of recognizing that, maybe you look just to the south of you or just down gradient to you, and not to Asia or South Africa or somewhere like that with a similar climate to what we have, because of those hazards with tamarisk. And that epitomizes. As far as that area along the Colorado River downstream from Dewey Bridge, that area has been there. That area, they have been trying to do a lot of restoration, and it's not just. It turns out actually that the tamarisk and Russian olive that grow right by the riverbank don't actually use that much more water than native vegetation does. But when you get the thing that makes it more of a water hog is that, it can actually has really long tap roots. So if it's higher up on the bench lands away from immediately by the riverside, where the native vegetation might be sage or rabbit brush, the tamarisk, because of its long roots, it can thrive farther away from the river, and it uses a lot more water than those, typically higher elevation plants. But even though it doesn't use that much more water than, say, cottonwoods or willows, there's still good reasons to get it out of there and replace it with the native vegetation, because it makes these dense thickets along the river that impede access, and they can even contribute to narrowing the channel of the river, because they kind of armor the banks, and so it interferes with the connection between the floodplain and the channel, and it's just not as good a habitat for a lot of things. So
what are they doing to restore it and get rid of that tamarisk, because you're right. I remember rafting, and if you got to a section where the tamarisk was too thick, you couldn't get off the river.
They're nasty thickets. A friend of mine was like, had the job of counting bugs in tamarisk thickets over a summer. I was really happy to have that summer be over with. But there are a couple of things. I mean, there are a lot of different, tamarisk is hard to get rid of. It really likes to grow back, and you can't burn it. It thrives on that better than anything around it. But the beetle, the tamarisk beetle that was released a while ago, it feeds only on tamarisk, and it actually really helped defoliate and kind of wear down some of that tamarisk. And then they also do mechanical treatments too. But an important thing that in the riparian restoration field has been recognizing increasingly that it's not enough just to get the bad plants out. If you don't, they'll just different invasives, alien invasives will come in. You have a field of kochia or something like that. If you don't do the long-term planning to really, get the desirable native plants reestablished in there. So, yeah, there's a lot of long-term practices and partnerships projects going on. The River's Edge West, which is based in Grand Junction but works throughout the West, is a fantastic resource. They really try to keep up with the latest research, and they coordinate partnerships between different folks and make connections between the scientists and the practitioners on the ground. So if you're interested in following up on that more, I definitely would recommend checking out their website and getting in touch with them.
Thank you. That's really great. That's really interesting. A lot of really good resources. Do we have any other, I guess, kind of quick questions since we've gone over that anyone wants to ask? Okay.
I'll just add real quick, Jenny.
Yeah.
I'm happy to hear any follow-up, or if anybody's, got something after I know we sort of data dump. So if anybody wants to email later or anything like that, I suppose they could contact you to get it from me, or you can just Google me at Mesa. I'm happy to help or direct you to the geologists I know that work in different specific geographic regions if somebody's thinking about something.
Thank you. That's great. That'd be a really great resource. So, other than that, thanks everyone for joining, and we'll keep everyone tuned with our next meetup and when that happens. And thank you.
Great, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.